The next topic that I'm going to cover is going to be this road is going to be slightly bumpy road, so please fasten your seat belts. If you have to take a break, please take a break, pause the video, come back with your pen and paper, okay? Because this is going to be slightly confusing and I need your 100% attention. What we will be doing in the next couple of minutes is going to be we will be looking at type 1 and type 2 errors, which are very important in statistics. We talked about type 1 error, which is alpha, the significance level. Today we will be talking about type 2 error, which is beta. Okay. Now, but before I talk about type 1, type 2, let's go ahead and see when do you make these errors in statistics. So before to jump into that, I have to take a step back. Remember, in your statistics, you only talk about H naught, right? Talk H naught to me. You only talk about H naught because either I am rejecting my H naught or I am not rejecting my H naught. Only two things that can happen. Either I reject my H naught or I not reject my H naught, right? But there are two errors that can happen. So what I want you to do is look on the screen right here. Look what happens. There are only two things that can happen. One, my H naught is true, right? My H naught is true. That's something. So my H naught is either true or false. So automatically, let me get two pens here. So automatically, if this is I have three in my hand. So if the red is H naught, the blue is HA. If H naught is true, automatically HA is false. If H naught is false, automatically HA is true. That's the concept, right? We talked about this in the last class. So, but my focus is only on H naught. I don't worry about HA, right? I'm going to keep this aside. Remember, when do I use my HA? Only to find out what tailed. So I'm going to keep this aside because this will help me only to tell me what tail it is. My concept is to either prove or disprove. So either H naught is true or H naught is false. That's all I care about. That's all I'm planning to prove. Because when I say this is true, automatically the other one is false. When I say this is false, automatically the other one is true. Very good. All right. Now, once you know that concept, let's go ahead and look. So two things can happen. The first one, H naught is true. When H naught is true, I keep it, right? So you do not reject it. Look at the terminology. I don't say, oh, I keep it. I use the words do not reject. So when H naught is true, I don't reject it. That is absolutely correct if that's the decision you made. But if H naught is true and you and you reject it, you made a mistake. Recap. If H naught is true and I don't reject it, I'm good. But if H naught is true and I reject it, I made a mistake. And that mistake is type 1 error. So this box kind of tells you exactly what you're doing. If H naught is true and you don't reject it, that's correct. But when H naught is true and you reject it, that's type 1 error. Now let's go ahead and look when H naught is false. When H naught is false, this is false. I reject it. Good. But when H naught is false, I don't reject it. Type 2 error. That's called false negative. Type 1 is false positive. Type 2 is false negative. Okay? Recap. H naught is true. I keep it, which is I don't reject it. H naught is true. I reject it. Type 1. H naught is false. I reject it. Very good. H naught is false. You don't reject it. Type 2. Always, always, always have this table in front of you when you are doing the problems so you understand better. Okay? Again, type 1 error is called alpha. That's the probability of rejecting your null hypothesis when your null hypothesis is true. Type 2 error is called beta. They are complements of one another. Alpha plus beta should give you a 1. And this is the decision to not reject your null hypothesis when it's actually false. Okay? Here's a quick example. Type 1 error is false positive. That means nothing happened, right? Nothing null, nothing. Null hypothesis is true. So there's nothing there, but where there's nothing, what you do? You should not reject it, but you're rejecting it. So it's false positive. As you can see here, it says he's not pregnant, nothing, null hypothesis, there's nothing there. But instead of saying no, what am I saying? I'm rejecting null hypothesis and I'm saying he is pregnant. That is false positive. Type 2 error, there is something because HA is true, because H naught is false, right? So she is pregnant right here, but I'm saying you're not. So this is false positive. And this is, this is false positive and this is false negative. So type 1 error is false positive, and this is false negative. Fair enough? False positive, false negative. When there is nothing, you say there is something. When there is something, you say there is nothing. Type 2. Okay? All right. Now, to make your life easier, I have divided type 1 and type 2 in different verbiage that's used in your book. Okay, let me scroll this just a little bit down. So here are 3 different categories. When you see the word evidence, so you will see words that say evidence, conclude, think. You all thinking about type 1, type 2, right? So when you see the word evidence and it's type 1 error, again, please be very careful. When you see the word evidence and you see type 1 error, the verbiage is sufficient evidence to conclude H naught. In fact, it's not. So we'll talk about each and everything differently. I'm going to do each and every example. So please, please, please have this table also ready with you when you're doing your problems because it makes it much more easy. Sometimes the verbiage could be confusing, especially when you're new to type 1 and type 2 errors. Okay? All right. So I highly recommend pause the video. Go ahead, ask yourself, what is type 1? What is type 1? H naught is true, but I reject it. Type 2, H naught is false, but I fail to reject it. Fair enough? All right. Let's look at, so I'm going to show you how to use this table based on your problems. Let's look at the first problem. Determine the type 1 error. So they're asking for type 1 error. If the null hypothesis H naught is a wooden ladder can withstand weights of 250 pounds and less. 250 pounds and less. So that's my H naught. My H naught is the wooden ladder can withstand 250 pounds and less. What is type 1 error? H naught is true. That means yes, the wooden ladder can withstand 250 pounds and less. But what do I say? I say no, it does not withstand. Right? False. Positive. Okay. All right. So what's happening here? They're asking for type 1. So if I were you, I would scale through the options and see what verbiage. When I'm scaling through my options, they're using the word think. Do you see that? So I'm going to go back here to my think table. Type 1, you think HA when in fact it can. You think H naught when in fact it cannot. Type 1 and type 2. But because they're asking me for type 1, I only look at this particular table here, this particular column. Okay, because the verbiage is think and I'm trying to talk about type 1 error. So what do I think? I think HA. Remember, H naught is true, but you kick it out. So you're thinking HA. You think the ladder can withstand weight of 250 pounds and less. No, that's not what you're thinking. You're thinking HA. You're thinking the ladder cannot withstand. In fact, the ladder can. Remember, what is type 1 error? The type 1 error is H naught is true, but you're not accepting it. The ladder can withstand, but you think it cannot. You think the ladder cannot withstand the weight of 250 pounds and less, when in fact it really can. So this is your options. See how it works? You look at the verbiage. The verbiage is think. So I'm going to the think section here. I'm only looking at type 1 error, so I only look at the first column. In the first column, what does it say? Think HA. HA is opposite of H naught, when in fact it can. So you will look for the keywords, in fact it can. The other way to look at the problem is, look how it says, in fact it cannot. So this is not my option. In fact it cannot. This is not my option. The verbiage has to match. So my only two options are in fact it can, in fact it can, but then I look at the first part. Think HA. What are you thinking? You're thinking the ladder cannot withstand. That is HA. So your only option here is option 2. Fair enough? All right. Again, H naught is true, but you're rejecting. The ladder can withstand, but you're saying it cannot withstand. All right. Again, take it really slow. I'm going to go ahead and erase this because I might need this later. Let's look at the next one here. Suppose the null hypothesis is H naught, is a surgical procedure is successful at least 80% of the time. So the surgical procedure is successful at least 80% of the time. An alternative hypothesis, HA, states that the doctor claims which is a surgical procedure is successful less than 80%. Remember what he's saying here. My null hypothesis says at least. How do I represent surgical procedure? I'm just going to say mu greater than or equal to 80%. So at least 80% of the time. But the doctor claims that it is less than 80%. Okay, so it's always nice to write down. This is my H naught. Let me change the color. This is my H naught and this is my HA. Okay, once I have that, I'm going to go ahead and see what are they asking me. Which of the following gives beta? Beta is type 2, beta, type 2 error. They're asking me for type 2 error. So I know my H naught, I know my HA. They're asking for type 2. The next step is you have to use the table. So you have to look into your options and see what's the verbiage. When I'm looking into my options, I see the word conclude, conclude, conclude. So I know I have to look in the conclude side. Again, type 2 and conclude. I'm going to scroll down. So this is conclude, right? And type 2. So when it's type 2 and conclude, what am I looking? What should the verbiage be? I'm going to show you a trick here. So when you're looking at type 2 and conclude, what is the verbiage? It should say cannot conclude. It should say cannot conclude. So look for the keywords that say cannot conclude in your options and you will see half of them are gone. So let's go ahead and do that. Cannot conclude. I'm going to erase these. This one says conclude. So I cannot, let me pick a red color. This one says conclude, so I cannot use that. This one says conclude, I cannot use that. Do you see that? And the next two options say do not conclude. Again, type 2 error, the verbiage is conclude. So when I go for type 2 and conclude, in my table, I'm looking for the keywords that say cannot conclude. So the first two are done. Now let's look at the next two. I'm going to go back to my table. What does it say? Cannot conclude HA when in fact HA. Look at the trick here. I should have HA repeating itself. I should have two HAs in my option. Cannot conclude is the keyword. HA, HA. So let me go back here. So in fact, what is your type 2 error? Your type 2 error, your H naught is false. H naught is false. When H naught is false, what is true? HA is true, right? But remember, you're making an error. So you're saying you're saying HA cannot conclude. If you do the right thing, it's not an error. You do the wrong thing, that's an error. Type 2 is H naught is false. That means HA is true. But you're saying this is not true. That's your type 2. Let's go ahead and take a look. The doc, again, take your time to read. So let me read these very slowly. I know the first two cannot be my options because the verbiage should have cannot conclude. Okay? All right. The doctor do not conclude, cannot, do not, right? Do not conclude that the surgical procedure is successful less than 80% of the time, when in fact the surgical procedure is successful less than 80% of the time. So look what it is, less than 80% of the time, where in fact it is less than 80% of the time. That is right. I cannot conclude my HA where in fact my HA is true, right? H naught is false. That means HA is true, type 2. This is true, but I cannot conclude it because I'm making an error. So my option is this, but let me go ahead and show you how the next one is not your option. The doctors do not conclude, the verbiage is check, that the surgical procedure is successful less than 80% of the time, where in fact the procedure is at least 80% of the time. No, it's not. It's always HA is true. So this is not my option. So be very, very, very careful when you're doing it. Your HA should repeat twice. Again, if you have any questions, probably we will do a quick session for all of us, but we'll talk about that later. So please read and check your verbiage. Now let's go ahead and take a look at one more. Determine the type 1 error if the null hypothesis is the percentage of homes in the city that are not up to the current electrical codes is no more than 10%. And the alternative is if the null hypothesis is no more than, then the alternative hypothesis has to be the percentage of homes in the city that are not up to the current electrical code is a more than, because they are completely complements of one another. And what are they asking us? So let me go ahead and highlight. They're asking type 1 error. So type 1. My next thing is to see what's the verbiage that they're using. They're talking about, oh, here they say evidence, evidence, and I see evidence. So let me go ahead, erase this. So I know it's type 1 error and I know the verbiage is evidence. So I'm going to scroll back here and I'm going to look for evidence and type 1 error. So this is evidence here and this is type 1 error. So I'm looking at this particular row. Okay? Again, type 1 evidence. So what should I say? My option should contain the verbiage sufficient evidence to conclude HA. In fact, it's not. Let's go ahead and take a look. Remember, what is type 1? H naught is true, but you're rejecting it. And you're saying HA is true, which is false. So I'm looking for the verbiage sufficient evidence. So this one has insufficient evidence. That's not my option. This one has insufficient. That's not my option. My only two options that have sufficient evidence are option 3 and option 4. Again, what should it say? Sufficient evidence to conclude HA. What is my HA? My HA is electrical codes are more than 10%. But when in fact, that's not the true one. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look. There is sufficient evidence to conclude that more than 10%, conclude more than 10% of homes in the city are not up to the current electrical code, where in fact, there are no more than 10% that are up no more than 10% that are not up to the current electrical code. Remember, type 1 H not is true. You're concluding HA, where in fact H not is true. So let's go back here. You are concluding HA, where in fact it's not true. So again, the verbiage is sufficient evidence. So my only two options are option 3 and 4. And I need to conclude HA. What is my HA? This is my HA. In fact, my keyword should say in fact. In fact, it's not true. So what does it mean? In fact, HA is true. In fact, there are no more than 10 that are not up to the current electrical code. So my key verbiage is sufficient evidence, in fact, and H not. So all these match. So this is my option. Let's read the next one. There is sufficient evidence to conclude that less than. No, I'm not concluding H not. I'm concluding nothing says less than here. When I look at this word less than, what says less than? This one doesn't say less than. This one doesn't say less than. Do you see that? You always have to stick to your H not and HA. I have nothing that says less than, so this is not my option. Let's do one last one. I know it's very confusing. I understand. And if we have to regroup one more time to talk about this, I will go ahead and do so. But please, please, please keep your patience. Look for what they're asking, go to the respective table and see what they have. Suppose the null hypothesis is H naught is more than 70% of the customers are at a sporting good. No more than 70%. So the maximum is 70%. When I say no more than, it's less than or equal to. Do not shop at any other sporting goods store. And the alternative hypothesis, HA, is that the sporting good claims that more than. So it's claiming more than 70%. The null hypothesis says no more than, and the alternative says more than, because they are complements of one another, right? They say more than 70% of the customers do not shop at any other sporting goods stores. What are they asking me for? They're asking me for beta, which is type 2 error. I know it's type 2. I'm going to look for the verbiage here. Probability? No. I'm going to look for the sporting conclude. There you go. My verbiage is conclude. So let me go to conclude and type 2 error. I'm going to erase these. I am looking for conclude and type 2. Do you see that? What should my verbiage say? Cannot conclude HA. In fact, when HA is true. Fair enough? Remember what is type 2 error? Type 2 error, H naught is false, but you are not rejecting it, you're keeping it. That means if H naught is false, HA is true. This is true, but I'm making an error. So I'm not concluding that that is true, but in fact, I'm sticking with this one. So cannot conclude HA, where in fact HA is true. So let me go ahead and look for the verbiage that says cannot conclude. So this one says can conclude, no. Can conclude, no. Cannot conclude, yes. Cannot conclude, yes. So just by looking at the verbiage, you know the first two are not your options. Cannot conclude what? I cannot conclude HA. But in fact, HA is true because my H naught is false. I cannot conclude that more than. Remember what is my HA? My HA is more than 70%. I cannot conclude more than 70% of its customers do not shop at any other shopping goods store where in fact no more than 70% of its where in fact no more than 70% of its customers do not shop at any other shopping goods. No. In fact, I cannot conclude HA when in fact HA is true. There's nothing about H naught. So this is not my option. Let's look at the next one. The probability that the sporting good cannot conclude that more than 70%, more than 70% is my HA, of its customers do not shop at any other shopping goods stores where in fact more than 70% of them shop at any other shopping store. So you cannot conclude HA where in fact HA. So your HA has to repeat. You should have more than 70% twice. All right? I hope this helps. If you have any questions, please contact me through email or Teams. And if this is confusing, I promise we will regroup. All right? Good luck.